Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Japan in the World, which is a completely unoriginal title for this sort of thing. I'm sure I've been to at least two things with that name, but no one copyrighted it, so we'll go with it. This will be a roundtable discussion of current challenges for Japanese international relations and Japan's relationships with the United States and its Asian neighbors, and the domestic politics of foreign policy making as well. This event is part of the 20th anniversary celebration of the UCLA Terasaki Center for Japanese Studies, and we'd like to thank Dr. Terasaki, as well as all of the center supporters, for enabling the center to underwrite faculty and graduate student research, to perform outreach to the community for Japan-related or Japanese cultural activities, and to produce events such as this one. And a special thanks this time for also giving us the use of the room. This is an interesting time to discuss Japanese foreign policy. The Cold War ended more than 20 years ago now. I have to explain to my students what it was before I talk about why it was, why its end matters. And since that time, Japan has emerged more and more from its post-World War II hangover and from the relative simplicity of its subordinate role as a loyal but passive American ally in Northeast Asia. Since the fraught debates over its non-participation in the Gulf War, or its financial-only participation, Japan has sent troops to participate in UN-sponsored peacekeeping operations all over the world. It's provided logistical support for the US and NATO efforts in Afghanistan, and even sent several hundred troops to Iraq while the insurgency was still raging. Closer to home, it has viewed the rise of China with some anxiousness, while North Korea has become ever more assertive and belligerent, sometimes in Japanese territorial waters. Long gone are the days of Japanese economic dominance. In 2011, Japan recorded its first trade deficit in decades. Its domestic economic malaise continues, with structural reform a work in progress at best, and with a rapidly aging and now shrinking population and workforce. Things are changing seemingly every week. Just recently, we've seen leadership turnover in North Korea, and just yesterday, or the day before, an announcement that North Korea has yet again agreed to suspend its nuclear weapons program in exchange for renewed food aid from the United States. China, too, will soon undergo major leadership turnover with unpredictable consequences for China-Japan relations and regional security more generally. The Great Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, which struck a year ago next week, might have produced a microcosm of the many dimensions on which Japan's political economy is now in flux. Most immediately, the terrible human toll and economic devastation will demand enormous resources at a time when Japan is already in doldrums economically. The immediate aftermath of the disaster showed the world just how dysfunctional Japanese domestic political process is and how unprepared the government was for crisis management. The physical destruction also affected the world economy, as vital factories in the Tohoku region were put offline, affecting supply lines for a rather enormous number of manufactured products. The meltdown of the Fukushima nuclear power plant not only turned a single natural disaster into a decades-long crisis, but it also reignited debates worldwide about nuclear energy and dramatically increased Japan's dependence on energy imports, as it must substitute foreign oil and coal for natural gas for nuclear power. On the other hand, the Operation Tomodachi assistance that the U.S. military provided to Tohoku warmed U.S.-Japan relations amidst an ongoing dispute over plans to relocate American troops in Okinawa. China, too, offered support for its stricken neighbor in a gratifying sign that some things, at least for a while, can supersede regional antagonisms. Now, without further ado, I'm privileged to introduce our distinguished panelists and then turn it over to them to enlighten us and inform us for the rest of the afternoon. I'll begin with our distinguished moderator, Tom Plate, who's sitting where you can't see him in the front. Tom Plate is a journalist, university professor, and internationally syndicated columnist, and he has a Wikipedia page, which is how I know all of the following. Over the last 15 years, his continuing column on Asia regularly has appeared in leading newspapers across the globe, including the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, Straits Times in Singapore, the Khaleej Times out of Dubai, the Japan Times, the Korea Times, Jakarta Post, Providence Journal, and many others. He was editor of the editorial pages of the Los Angeles Times from 1989 to 1995, and an LA Times op-ed columnist until 1999. He's now on the faculty of Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Tom's career as a journalist includes stints at Newsday, New York Magazine, Los Angeles Herald Examiner, Daily Mail of London, Time Magazine, and of course the LA Times. Here's just a partial list of the leading political figures that Tom has interviewed. US Presidents Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, British Prime Ministers John Major and Tony Blair, Japanese Prime Ministers Keizo Obuchi and Junichiro Koizumi, South Korean Presidents Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae-jung, Singaporean Minister Mentor, my favorite title, Lee Kuan Yew, Malaysian Prime Minister Mohammed Mahathir, and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And he's written several books with some of these individuals as the principals. Conversations with Mahathir Mohamad, conversations with Lee Kuan Yew, really a lot of them. From 1994 to 2008, Professor Plate taught undergraduate courses in media ethics and Asian politics and media at the UCLA. And while there, he founded the campus-based nonprofit Asia Pacific Media Center. He's currently a senior fellow at the USC Center for the Digital Future. At Loyola Marymount University in LA, he's a distinguished scholar of Asian and Pacific Studies and founder and editor-in-chief of New Asia Media, the successor to the UCLA version of Asia Media. So welcome, Tom, and thank you very much for participating. Toshiaki Miura, on my far left, is an editorial writer for the Asahi Shinbun in Tokyo, Japan. Flew here just for this. Mr. Miura earned his BA in political science from Waseda University and his MA in public administration from International Christian University. At Asahi Shinbun, he has served as the chief diplomatic correspondent, political correspondent in Washington, D.C., deputy editor of the political news department, and editorial writer. He has taught U.S.-Japan relations at Gakushuin University. His books include Nishibe Dome Hanseki, 50 Years of the U.S.-Japan Alliance, Bush no America, don't have to translate that, America under, I will anyway, the Bush administration, and Nekishi to Mukiao, Facing Up to History. In 2009-10, he received an Abe Fellowship to research historical memory and politics in East Asia from the perspective of U.S.-Japan relations at Harvard University. Mireya Solis, right next to me, is associate professor at the School of International Service, American University. She holds a PhD in political science from Harvard University. Her research interests include comparative and international political economy, comparative studies of regional integration, trade policy, and Japanese politics and foreign economic policy. She's received grants from the Japan Foundation and the Ford Foundation, as well as an Abe Fellowship and a Fulbright. Professor Solis has authored or co-edited several books, Banking on Multinationals, Public Credit, and the Export of Japanese Sunset Industries, Cross-Regional Trade Agreements, Understanding Fragmented Regionalism in East Asia, and Competitive Regionalism, Explaining the Diffusion and Implications of FTAs, Free Trade Agreements, in the Pacific Rim. Dr. Solis has published articles in journals such as International Studies Quarterly, Review of International Political Economy, and a bunch of other names of journals that would impress political scientists if there were more of us here. Really an impressive CV. Her research interests cover comparative international political economy, comparative studies of regional integration, trade policy, and foreign economic policy. Her current research, if this is up to date, focuses on East Asian regionalism with a special emphasis on Japan's new policy to negotiate preferential trade agreements. Jun Saito. Jun and I apparently met when he was an undergraduate and I was a graduate student, but neither one of us remembers it, many years ago in San Diego. Jun is assistant professor of political science at Yale University. He previously taught at Wesleyan and Franklin and Marshall College. His research focuses on the institutional determinants of representation and redistribution, in particular how choices of constitutional structures and electoral institutions translate into redistributive consequences. At Yale, he teaches courses on Japanese politics, international relations in East Asia, and comparative political institutions. His co-authored article with Yusaku Horiuchi won the 2004 Alan Rosenthal Award from the Legislative Studies section of the American Political Science Association. He was once a member of the Japanese House of Representatives. And I know I'm speaking quickly, but let me pause on that one. So Jun took a couple years off from his PhD program against the wishes of his advisor and my former advisor. She called me and said, "You've got to talk Jun out of this. This is a terrible idea." And I said, "This is the greatest field work of all time." He took a couple years off from grad school to run for the Diet. There was a disgraced LDP Diet man who resigned his seat, so there was an open seat, and Jun went and grabbed it and did a little field work in the halls of the Diet for 2 years. Yeah. Professor Saito's recent Japanese language book, Jiminto Choki Seiken no Seiji Keizai Gaku, The Political Economy of the LDP Regime, won the 54th Nikkei Cultural Award for publications in economics. Lucky for all of us, he's now translating this into English, writing a new book manuscript, an additional book manuscript on the political economy of Japan after the regime change, and co-editing yet another book on structural reform in Japan. Jun has published more than a dozen peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and seems to be working on about a dozen new projects right now. Finally, last and certainly not least, Chris Hughes is Professor of International Politics and Japanese Studies at the University of Warwick, a research associate at the Center for the Study of Globalization and Regionalization, and head of the Department of Politics and International Studies. Previously, he was a research associate at the Institute for Peace Science at Hiroshima University. In 2006, he held the Asahi Shinbun Visiting Chair of Mass Media and Politics at the Faculty of Law, University of Tokyo. He holds degrees from the Universities of Oxford, Rochester, and Sheffield, various credentials and initials after those. He has been a research associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and a visiting scholar at the East Asia Institute, the Free University of Berlin. In 2009-10, he was the Edwin O. Reischauer Visiting Professor of Japanese Studies at Harvard. He's received research scholarships from the Japanese Ministry of Education, the Japan Foundation Endowment Committee, the European Union, the British Council, and the British Academy. Professor Hughes is the author of 4 books on Japanese security policy, co-author of 2 more books on Japanese international relations, and co-editor of 5 more books on various aspects of globalization, regionalization, and political violence. He's also published several dozen articles in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes. He's a frequent media contributor on 3 continents, has presented countless invited lectures to academic and non-academic audiences all over the world, not hard to find on podcasts if you want to go searching on the internet. I was, of course, aware of Chris's stature in the fields of Japanese security policy and international relations before I invited him to join us for this event. Had I actually sat down and read his full bio, I wouldn't have bothered to invite him because I would have thought there was no way he was going to be available. We are delighted that he was willing and frankly astounded that he was available to fly from the UK for this event. Okay. I will stop now because I'm using up what little time we have with our panelists. Just thank all of them for coming in advance, and thank all of you for coming, and we'll see you afterwards. Tom.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone, and I see one LMU student in the back. Thank you for coming. This is spring break for LMU, and during spring break, students generally do not go to events of this nature. They have their own events in mind, I'm sure. I'd like to I'd like to set the stage for a discussion that will largely involve my listening along with you, because the 4 panelists here have forgotten more about Japan than I'll ever know. I'm a mere journalist, and I say that with some modesty because we know a lot about a bunch of things and not too much about any one thing. But the issue of Japan and its future relationship with the United States and its future relationship with its neighbors in Asia, I actually think is one of the most interesting issues in that part of the world. And I think it's very important, and I think its importance has been somewhat lost mainly because of American journalists who, in general, American media is pretty much incapable of focusing on more than 1 or 2 international events at any one time. And the fact of the matter is that I remember back in the late 90s, I was interviewing the foreign minister of Japan, and they had come up with a phrase to describe the American attitude towards them as Japan passing, if you remember that. And the idea was that the United States was preoccupied with China and the relationship with China. And there is no argument there. Obviously, the relationship between the United States and China is a huge aspect of international stability and the future of world politics. But if you are reading only the American news media, you might think that Japan has simply disappeared from Asia in a certain sense, and that's not right. Japan remains the 3rd largest economy in the world. It remains our #1 security alliance, and of course we always talk about now not so much Japan passing, but China hedging. And it remains a country of enormous strength and power, innovation, impact on world politics, and I think it's way, way too early to count Japan out, if that's what anybody wants to do. And so for me, as a journalist, having an opportunity to, in 2 hours, really to listen to the best thoughts of some of the best people on this subject is actually a treat, and it's also an exercise in efficiency for me. So what I would like to do as a moderator is to be both moderate and immoderate. On the moderate side is to be quiet in a few seconds and turn it over to the panel. On the immoderate side, I'd like to, if you don't mind, ladies and gentlemen, just do what I like to do, which is jump in once in a while and ask a crazy question. And then if you say to me, that's a crazy question, that's fine, because then you'll know what's the uncrazy correct answer. So rather than be intimidated and ask you necessarily proportionate and proper questions, I'll probably go the other way just for the effect that I think it will have on the discussion. And with that final comment, I think the best way to do this is simply to start with the lady, if you don't mind, and work that way. Each of them, I think, has a bit of a presentation, and that should probably get us to about 4:10 when I know Michael would like us to do interactive questions. So why don't we start then with the lady?
Thank you very much. I think this is working. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the Terasaki Center and Mike Thies and Tom Plate and everybody who made this possible. It's really a pleasure to be here. And it's also a treat for me to be listening to my colleagues and learning a lot from them. So we were asked to identify 5 key challenges in specific areas that we work, sort of lay out some themes, some topics, pique your curiosity, and then get the conversation going. And since I've been working on the world of trade and regional integration, those are the key challenges that I identified. And I think these are really very serious challenges. I'll lay them out for you, and then I would be curious to see your reaction. And I'll start with the word marginalization. I think it really has come to that Japan may be marginal in the world of international trade. And I think that's one thing that needs to be addressed quite rapidly. The fact is that we have a multilateral trading system, the WTO, who has faced deadlock. The negotiations are not moving there, and countries have decided to go ahead and negotiate these preferential trade agreements. And Japan, unfortunately, has lagged behind. And countries like Korea have negotiated far more ambitious trade agreements. And Japan very much is a country built on trade. Trade has been central to the economic takeoff of Japan. It's important that Japan does not remain in the sidelines. And for Japan to be able to negotiate agreements that do have an impact, that make Japan a player, domestic consensus is necessary. And that is what's sorely lacking. And therefore, you would need a formulation that's in the national interest of Japan to be an active player in this negotiation. So I lay that as one main challenge. The second challenge, I think, is from a point of view of US-Japan relations. And I know that this is not true in this room and certainly not among my colleagues, but oftentimes I think that people have not updated their perception of Japan. And I say that especially because of my students, for example, they write off Japan. They think that these 2 decades, nothing has changed in Japan, and actually quite dramatic transformations are taking place. And I think it's important for both the United States and Japan to come forward with a statement that reconceptualizes, casts a different light on the role that economic relations can have on the bilateral partnership. Long gone are the days where trade would make these 2 countries drift apart, where there was trade friction. That's not longer the case. There are ample areas of cooperation for both countries in order to generate new rules on investment and intellectual property. And sometimes I think the media focuses, and no offense, focuses on the difficulties without realizing that there's a shared agenda and that this can be a constructive partnership. I call it an alliance for trade. My third challenge, and I know that this is very controversial in Japan, and I hope that we have an active, vigorous discussion of this. I do believe that Japan is better off participating in the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership Initiative. This is a very ambitious trade agreement that would bring together countries across the Asia-Pacific, And I cannot be very long in this presentation. This is just a tease for all of you. But I think that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, could be a game changer in many ways that I'll be happy to address later. And Japan being absent from that negotiation could impact negatively. I think Japan gains leverage by being there. My fourth challenge is that it is very tricky, but it's important to devise a constructive approach towards China in terms of regional integration. It's also very important to avoid what many economists are concerned that there's so many different trade agreements. You have an acronym soup, you have a noodle bowl, so it's very important to have sort of a coherent plan for how Japan will pursue perhaps Asia-Pacific trade agreements and then purely East Asia initiatives. And the last one is, of course, a difficult one, that Japanese industry has had a rough time recently because of the double punch, energy uncertainty, yen appreciation. It's important to address those issues so that industry can be fully competitive, that they feel that they have the necessary platform to continue to do productive investments and businesses. And I would conclude by saying that I think it's very important also to nurture human capital. And I'll be happy to expand on this in a minute, or later. I've been participating in a Mansfield Foundation project on how to revitalize U.S.-Japan relations. And we started with the usual suspects. It was trade, it was investment, and there was one thing that kept coming our way from everyone that we queried as to how you actually get a robust economic relationship, and it actually boils down to human capital. To all the students here who have an interest in Japan, we're going to spend time there, and later on we'll become the stakeholders of these relationships. So I think it's very important to continue to nurture this. Thank you.
Professor Solis, that's a breathtaking and beautifully done toward the horizon of some of these issues. And I notice you've listed them as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But before we go to Mr. Saito, is any one of those more important than the other? Is there any one of those, the Grand Canyon, collapse if it doesn't go the way you think it should go?
I think avoiding marginalization would be key, and I think the other ones could be subsumed in that one. That Japan does not want to put itself in timeout because it does not have the necessary domestic consensus to take on and be an active player in the world of trade.
By marginalization, you just simply mean a kind of shrinking inwards and basically not willing to partake of the rough and tumble of trade negotiations because of fear of domestic constituencies and an inept political establishment. Is that right?
That's what I mean, yes.
Good. Mr. Saito, follow that if you can.
Oops. Hi, I feel highly honored to have this opportunity to talk about Japan's place in the world at this Terasaki Institute. Because my research expertise pertains more to domestic politics as opposed to international relations, let me focus more on the domestic sources of Japan's foreign policy challenges. Thus, I will ignore something that is external or exogenous to the Japanese domestic society, like the rise of China or the relative decline of the United States, changing international power balances, etc. So the first thing I'd like to address as a challenge to Japan's foreign policy making is basically domestic political instability. We have seen as many as 6 prime ministers come and go over the last 6 years. This is something that is unprecedented in the country sample of advanced industrial democracies, except perhaps Finland, which had observed 5 prime ministers in 5 years in the 1950s. Except for that particular case, Japan produced the largest number of prime ministers over a short span of time. Why is politics in Japan so unstable? I'd say that the reason is fairly clear. One is the impossible combination of constitutional design. Japan is a parliamentary system with a bicameral legislature, and whenever the the partisan control over the lower and the upper house is divided, parliamentary constitutions fail to work properly. Well, if you take a look at the recent history of Japanese politics, Japan certainly had coherent leadership under Prime Minister Koizumi. But if you take a close look at how Koizumi administration was established, Prime Minister Koizumi was playing the game in terms of backward induction. He timed the month of inauguration exactly 3 months prior to the upcoming upper house election back in 2001. He took advantage of the popularity immediately after the inauguration to win landslide in the upper house election. Because he was able to generate a large electoral margin in that particular upper house election in 2001, he was able to retain his leadership position for the next 5 years. His successors didn't incorporate this sort of strategic calculation, and the end result was miserable showing of the prime ministers. And in addition to the bicameral division under the parliamentary constitution, the new electoral institution, which magnified the electoral swing, shortened the politicians' time horizon, and they became myopic and that, in my impression, affected the relative power balance between the politicians and the bureaucrats, and the political instability ended up harming political accountability mechanism in Japan, which has made the Japanese politicians and bureaucrats on average difficult to commit to any sorts of diplomatic bargaining outcomes and so on, which I think is a big foreign policy challenge. The second item I'd like to raise is what is rent-seeking and politics of inward looking. Rent-seeking is basically unhealthy pursuit of political or economic gains using collusive natures of political economy. Cozy relationship between politicians and businesses and so on. Japan's inward-looking attitude is evidenced by several major indicators. For instance, declining number of foreign students, Japanese students spending their college years or graduate school years in the United States or elsewhere, for instance. Well, the shrinking share of trade as opposed to the GDP, as well as stagnant figure of inward as well as outward-oriented foreign direct investment, and so on. Well, despite this recent move of inward-looking orientation, Japan had a history of outward orientation. If you take a look at the Japanese history, Japantown in Ayutthaya in the 16th century, or Red Seal ship in the following century, Japan certainly had a history of outward orientation, but still, I would say that, especially since 1985, when the Plaza Accord was agreed upon, as well as Maekawa report was released in the following year, the Japanese government has certainly adopted a policy of inward looking. Currency appreciation magnified this move. And I would characterize this inward-looking orientation as the curse of Japanese yen. No Japanese people would have gained by investing abroad or investing in learning about other countries because profitability of the investment measured in Japanese yen was always negative because of the constant trend of currency appreciation. The idea of the currency appreciation was to stimulate the Japanese domestic demand And the government has certainly adopted the policy of expanding public investment in the late 80s and the mid 1990s, but that exacerbated the sort of rent-seeking activities. And the currency appreciation also affected the domestic power balance. It ended up killing the Japanese competitive export industries and empowered industries that gain from import, like electricity companies and trading companies. I think that's a challenge which we need to analyze more explicitly. A weak democratic governance and accountability mechanism is related to the two items I have already raised. One reason why the Japanese currency continued to appreciate is the central bank independence, which worked adversely to the Japanese macroeconomic performance. The sudden collapse of the real estate bubble in the late 1980s and early 1990s is obviously related to the bad monetary policy management. Fiscal policy is also a challenge, which is a mirror image of this Bank of Japan problem. Private sector agents also incorporated the weak government oversight, politicians' oversight over the bureaucratic entities. And who is held accountable for bad policy management? It's certainly unclear in the Japanese political system. And it appears that politicians are always held accountable for government policy mistakes, but bureaucrats are not necessarily so. And another thing I'd like to raise is disruption of foreign policy expertise. This is especially the case after the DPJ government was installed back in 2009. If you practice diplomacy, you need a lot of expertise and private information. And the sort of private information that pertains to diplomacy was not carried over from the LDP government to the DPJ. Who promised what with whom? In order for the government to practice diplomacy, the government elite need this sort of information, but there seems to have been disruption of private information essential to governing Japan, and Hatoyama's bad performance regarding Futenma issue, as well as the DPJ government's poor showing after the Senka crisis indicates this disruption. As a political scientist, political scientists as a discipline, as an academic community, share some sort of prescription about what to do when certain kinds of problems happen. We have an idea about what sort of institutional reforms are necessary to make the Japanese political system to perform better. But because the Japanese constitution is very difficult to revise, and because the incumbent politicians are elected under the current electoral institutions, they do not have a strong incentive to reform the environment in which they make decisions. So the sort of challenges I have raised will continue into the future, in addition to other difficult to change items like earthquakes and demographics. Thank you.
Another terrific tour de horizon. If I may ask, I think actually you're a reasonably famous person. Under the Koizumi government, you were one of the assassins, right? One of Koizumi's assassins?
Oh, actually, I was not.
Let me explain what that is. Koizumi wanted to change the diet, and he wanted to get at the old, I have to use the right word here, deadwood, and people who were against his reform, right? And so he picked some sparkling, spectacular young people to run against the deadwood, and they were called Koizumi's assassins, and you were one of the assassins.
Actually, my election was one election cycle before that.
Oh, you prefigured the assassinations.
Yeah. And I was actually running from the DPJ against the LDP power King Wheel.
Well, that's right. Now, before we go over to Christopher, just very quickly, you noted that Koizumi had a full term.
Yeah.
And it was the only prime minister in 1,000 years that's had the full 5-year term. But I think you were saying or suggesting that on the whole you think his administration, even though he had 5 years, was not successful. Is that right? Okay, good. Christopher.
Oh, thanks, Jim. Hope it's going to... I'm not pulling out any leads, am I? Is it going to stretch this far? Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you very much, Tom, and Mike. And
Is that comfortable?
yeah, I'm fine. I just wasn't... I didn't want to pull... Oh, okay, good. Okay.
Plenty of rope for you, Christopher.
Good. To hang myself. Yeah. Right. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Again, thanks. I'd like to say thanks, of course, for the invitation to be here today. It's a pleasure to come to LA, not least to get some winter sunshine. Anyway, yeah, I've got five challenges, which may be up on the slide. Yeah, 5 challenges for Japan's foreign policy and security relations. First one, I think, is kind of the main framing one, which is, I mean, I would argue at least that Japan needs to accept that the world has changed fundamentally. The international structure has changed, and we are entering into some kind of more multipolar global and regional order. That doesn't mean to say the United States is becoming less important. And of course, we're seeing the United States pivoting back towards East Asia and the Asia Pacific in a number of ways. And of course, Japan is going to be very important within that US strategy. But I think what we are seeing is what's often called the kind of the rise of the rest, or what we might call a kind of contested dominance, where the United States clearly is not going to have the international system running necessarily to its own agenda the whole time. So Japan, I think Japanese policymakers recognize this, but they haven't really accepted it as yet. There's still some kind of burying their heads in the sand and hoping that the world would just kind of correct itself back to this US-led international order and everything will be okay. So I think Japan really needs to kind of recognize this shift to multipolarity, and that means that Japan is going to have to shift its strategy somewhat. I would argue that Japan needs to kind of revamp the old Yoshida doctrine. The Yoshida doctrine has become kind of distorted in Japanese eyes to mean that Japan should just simply follow the United States and stick like glue to the United States. But of course that was never the intention of Prime Minister Yoshida when he framed Japan's post-war strategy. Of course it was to stick close to the United States, but at the same time to maintain options when necessary to act outside the sphere of US dominance. So I think that means that Japan's going to have to work much harder in East Asia and much harder globally in order to try and face up to these realities of multipolarity. And I think specifically that means more multilateral interaction with its neighbors, and I would argue, and possibly some divergence from what Mireya was saying, I think Japan should prioritize East Asian regionalism over Asia-Pacific regionalism. And that may have to be the main sphere of action for Japan, and I'll explain that later. Second challenge, of course, is to maintain the US-Japan alliance. This is going to remain the bedrock in many ways of Japan's diplomacy and security strategy, particularly security strategy, and Japan will have to strengthen the alliance. There's no doubt the United States will demand this of Japan, and Japan has rising security challenges where Japan has few alternatives in the security sphere, or the military sphere at least, so there will have to be strengthening of the alliance. But at the same time, Japan is going to have to manage this alliance very, very carefully and continue to do so. Expectations must be managed. I think the alliance was very much overhyped in terms of what it could do outside the East Asia region under Koizumi. That created kind of false expectations, which then, of course, were disappointed in the post-Koizumi era. So I think both alliance managers and sort of Japan handlers in the United States are going to have to get a more sort of clearer idea, really, of what they expect the alliance to do, and really focus on the core functions of the alliance, which for Japan, of course, is peace and security in the East Asia region. So I think there needs to be a refocus very much on those core functions if the alliance is really to be consolidated and both sides are to have political confidence in the continuation and strengthening of the alliance. That means for the United States, Japan has to be treated as a genuine partner. And I think at times the United States has to give Japan a little bit more autonomy and allow Japan to follow some of its instincts in terms of how it wants to behave in the East Asia region. I think what we saw under the initial stages of the DPJ was this very strange US counter-reaction to any kind of attempt at Japan to stake out a position of autonomy, which could have actually been quite constructive for US interests in the region. And I think that was ultimately quite harmful to the alliance.
Chris, you mean that the U.S., Washington was begrudging of any
Right.
show of independence?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, there was kind of very strange kind of paranoia that somehow, Japan, because it wasn't going to just simply sort of play ball and stick as close to the United States as under Koizumi. Somehow Japan was making some dash for complete strategic autonomy. It was even trying to sort of dismantle the US-Japan alliance, which is really a rather absurd kind of perception that was spread about the DPJ at that time. And I think, as maybe we can talk later in the discussion, I think Japan was trying to do in many ways was strengthen the alliance in certain ways.
But certainly the knee-jerk unthinking Washington reaction certainly was consistent with the way they generally react, right, whenever Tokyo has a big proposal.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. So there needs to be a little bit more I think the US needs to cut Japan a bit more slack in terms of,
right.
And I think that will actually be ultimately productive and helpful for the alliance. But Japan also needs, I think I've often said, Japan needs a bit of a plan B at certain times. It shouldn't always readily default to dependence on the United States when things get tough, and it needs to work to develop those other kinds of options outside the US-Japan alliance. Third challenge is how to deal with China and East Asia. Clearly Japan and China have to reach some kind of modus vivendi. They have to coexist. I would argue that economic interdependence is not enough for managing this relationship. There is a kind of tendency amongst Japanese policymakers, I think, sometimes to think, well, in the end, the economic interdependency will kind of correct the more extreme fluctuations in the relationship. Things are not too bad now in some ways between Japan and China. Things have kind of self-corrected again, but it's clear that there are sort of deep structural tensions in that relationship. History has kind of gone away for the moment, but we can see it kind of rearing its head again with some revisionist statements by local politicians. And likewise, I think Japan doesn't mean Japan has to kind of cave in to Chinese pressure in certain areas. It doesn't have to accommodate China. I think Japan has to be very kind of clear about what its security interests are, what its core security interests are, what the red lines are that China must not cross. And in that way try to sort of create a more kind of transparent and clear strategic intention towards China and sort of stake out its position. But also I'd say it's clear that Japan cannot manage China on its own. Clearly the alliance is going to be very, very important in managing that relationship, US-Japan alliance. But Japan is also going to need other partners in managing China's continuing rise, or even the problems that China is going to encounter in its rise and the kind of domestic instability that may accompany it, and so on. And that means not a coalition of states to kind of surround or contain China, but I think, as I was saying earlier, I think it needs functioning East Asian regionalism, where China is fully integrated as a partner rather than as a kind of object of cooperation of Japan and its partners towards China. It actually needs to be brought in, and sort of key functional issues need to be dealt with. Fourth challenge is Japan and the Korean Peninsula. Japan somehow has to find a way of rehabilitating itself as a meaningful support actor on the Korean Peninsula. It's really abdicated that role for the last sort of 4 or 5 years. And it's been able to do that because essentially it's been able to hide behind the United States. As North Korea has refused to engage with the outside world, Japan has been able to sort of really kind of put North Korea in the too difficult box for that period, and really didn't have to think about this kind of knotty problem of how to deal and how to support North Korean denuclearization, simply because nothing was happening. And Japan could hide behind the United States. But things are moving again now. And if Japan sits there with no kind of proposal, with no active role, then it's going to be left behind and marginalized as events develop on the Korean Peninsula. So this is going to mean for Japan getting a more active Korean Peninsula strategy, and above all, it's going to mean tackling those domestic obstacles to a more fulsome role on the Korean Peninsula. And of course, that means trying to, once again, showing some leadership on trying to remove the problem of the abductees in order to free up Japanese diplomacy to support international efforts on the Korean Peninsula. It's also going to mean a more consistent policy towards South Korea as well. There's going to be a lot of fluctuations in South Korean administrations. There's going to be tensions over history, over territory, and so on. Japanese policymakers have got to remain calm and consistent and engage with South Korean administrations, whoever they are, in order to pursue this larger strategic goal of stability on the Korean Peninsula. And then the final challenge, I think, is energy security. Japan, of course, is now, with the if it happens or not, we'll have to see. I'm not an expert on this, but if Japan is really to abandon civilian nuclear power, which was, I think, estimated by 2030 was supposed to provide 50% of Japanese energy consumption, somehow Japan's going to have to fill that huge hole in its energy supplies. And of course, it can only do that through external imports. And I think this is going to be a great test for Japanese policymakers' ingenuity and their ability to not only work alongside the United States, but also deal with rivalries with China in key energy markets. And also it's going to make for very interesting, I think, issues if the Iran situation deteriorates even further. Japan is going to have some very interesting choices to make about energy supplies from Iran. Of course, it's already beginning to cut those, but it may have to cut those entirely. And of course, what's that going to do to a very energy-starved Japan at this particular moment? So I think energy security is going to show up many of the sort of problems of Japan trying to operate in this more sort of fluid international environment.
Chris, that's another impressive and comprehensive look. And before I go to my fellow journalists, I just wanted to slightly disagree with you on one thing, just for fun, and also I know you can take it easily. And that is that, Japan's diplomacy with North Korea may not be work of genius, but in all fairness, North Koreans are tough to deal with. And, give him credit for Koizumi for all this. I mean, he did go up there to Pyongyang. Which no Japanese prime minister have ever done. So I would be a little lighter on the Japanese on the North Korean issue because it's a tough one. I'd like to just mention to my students the final of the four panelists, Toshiaki Miura, two things you really need to know about him. One is that he is editorial writer for Asahi Shinbun, which is really a great newspaper, and one of the great newspapers of the world with a huge circulation. It's about 7 million circulation. Yeah. Did you know that the largest circulation newspaper in the United States, the Wall Street Journal, is only about 2 million?
It's officially 8 million, but actually 7 million.
Population of Japan, and his newspaper has 7 million. And the other thing is he's a graduate of Wasa University, which is one of the 4 best in Japan. I've never lectured at Wasa. I did lecture at Kyoto. It was a great honor, but I'm a little bit in awe of this guy because for a journalist, this guy's really got credentials. So I'm going to bow out and let him make your presentation.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, right.
Seems to be, we need some lead. We need a bit of slack there.
Well, thank you very much for a kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to this program. I would like to thank Terasaki Institute and UCLA and everybody who supported this program. It is often said that Japanese start speeches with an apology, and I'm not an exception. I'm sorry I have not sent my 5 key challenges in advance, so they will not appear here, so I will do it orally. But first, since I'm based in Japan, and it's going to be just 1 year after March 11th, the great earthquake and tsunami, I would like to say a few words that how much the Japanese people have appreciated the kindness and generosity shown by the people all over the world, particularly by the people in the United States. One Harvard professor told me that when he went to Tokyo in November last year, when he took a taxi, the taxi driver asked, "Are you an American?" "Yes," replied the professor. Then the driver said, thank you very much for your kindness, and thank you for the operation of Tomodachi." And I think this kind of feeling is really felt widely at the grassroots in Japan. Well, since I'm a journalist, so what I'm going to talk about is not very theoretical. Maybe it's based on my close observation of Japanese politics. I have been covering Japanese politics for 24 years, since 1988. But I must confess that it's one of the most depressing things in the world to explain about Japanese politics these days. When the earthquake and tsunami happened, I thought, and many people in Japan thought, this can be turned into an opportunity. History tells us a lot of examples that catastrophes and crises can be turned into great opportunities. And just like Professor Dower of MIT showed in his Pulitzer-winning book, Embracing the Defeat, the Japanese people, with the cooperation of the Americans, we could change Japan and succeed in remaking Japan into a new democracy. So some people actually said that this is the greatest, this tsunami and earthquake was the greatest, crisis since World War II. So it means that we can do it again. But unfortunately, what has happened was quite different. Just within a couple of months, the Japanese politics was playing the old same game again. Partisan politics and people's distrust of government, and every these malaise were happening again or even worsening. And I would like to ask why. I would like to take up 5 key challenges. The first one is instability of politics, particularly the position of party leaders are now very weak. The office of Prime Minister, as well as the position of Mr. Tanigaki, the top of the LDP, well, also weak. And the second challenge is volatile public opinion. A majority of Japanese people switch their party support almost every time when they go to election. And people soon lose trust in party leaders. So it's pretty tough for any prime minister to maintain his popularity. And Koizumi was the only exception in the last 10 years. And the third challenge is, this is my field, I think media's, maybe I should call it media's addiction to political changes. So it's quite natural for any journalist, any political journalist to see, government collapse and new, prime minister coming in. It's very exciting, but it almost reached a kind of addiction that, too much focus on these political changes and power shift, and we have not paid much attention to real substance of policies in these, more long-ranging problems of political landscape. I think these 3 elements, weak political leadership, volatile public opinion, and media's addiction to political changes, these are 3 form a kind of vicious cycle which really are supporting each other in deteriorating Japanese politics. And my 4th and 5th challenges are the products of these first 3. The first challenge is the rise of populism at local level. I don't know how much is reported here in the US media, but in Japanese media, there has been a lot of reports about this movement, particularly Osaka City Mayor Hashimoto, who is now taking a very, very strong populist stance. He's not afraid of calling himself dictatorship. He says this is a democracy which can decide things. So in his eyes, check and balance is just an obstacle to political leadership. And because Japanese people are fed up with these, deteriorating party politics, they are fed up with the LDP as well as with the DPJ. So now this new movement is gaining momentum in Japanese politics, and it's going to be one of the very key factors this year. And the fifth challenge is lack of strategic thinking, particularly in foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And I think people do talk about FTEMA issue and DPJ's mishandling of US-based problem. But also we have a problem of inconsistent policy toward China. I think these two issues are the two sides of the same coin. So in all these 5 challenges, I think the most fundamental problem is the first one, in unstable political leadership, particularly in the Prime Minister side. And I would like to address this issue later in detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Before we go to, I guess, the Q&A from the audience, I'd like to exercise what little prerogative the moderator has and just ask you to bear with me for 2 minutes, and because I'm going to ask you all the same question, and it's a very unfair question. So I want you to be prepared. The 2 minutes that I need is I am basically a student in a way of my good friend and colleague Kishore Mahbubani in Singapore. And Kishore has, of course, his famous theory of the 2 suns. Not the son and daughter, but son like and really hot. You know the theory? You know this theory? It's really great. Until relatively recently, the world geopolitical universe had been one sun. And around it, the planets, all the other countries, had an orbit. You didn't want to get too close because you'd burn up. Too far away, it's too cold. And everything was pretty much settled. Planets weren't running into one another because the orbits had been settled because there's just one sun. Now, coming into this world universe is the second sun with its own gravitational pull. That, of course, that sun is China. And it's so big, the sun, that it's exerting gravitational forces on all these other planets, all these other countries, that now have to adjust their orbits around 2 suns. You see, they have to change. They have to change. So you're talking about Japan having to change because they can't just, it's not simple anymore. Now you have 2 suns. So the metaphor of the 2 suns says this is the profound geopolitical change that the world is undergoing. And Japan, for all its strength and power and so forth, is one of those planets, as maybe think of it as Jupiter, that's going to have to change its orbit too because of this second sun. With that as the setting, here is my question. A new prime minister has come to power in Japan, and he or she has asked you to be her special advisor on foreign policy. And he or she, the new prime minister of Japan, calls you in and says, I want us to be smarter about China. Just don't give me a list. I'm not good with lists. I'm a politician. I have a short memory. What's the one thing I need to do for Japan so that we're smarter in our relationship with China? It's a tough question, but you guys I'd rather hear from you than almost anyone else. You want to go first? Or anybody? Who wants to go first? Chris, you want to try that? Just give me one thing. Give us one thing you would tell a new prime minister of Japan with regard to China.
One thing, yeah. Okay. I guess it's really kind of almost what I was saying in my introductory remarks. Really, I mean, this is one thing. But I mean, China. I mean, I agree with you. It's a kind of inescapable fact that China is rising. We don't know how far it's going to rise. We don't know how smoothly it's going to rise. But clearly, it's here to stay as a great power in the region, and this is very much restructuring the international system in East Asia. So, my one thing I would tell the Prime Minister is that you cannot shirk this. You have to face this head on, but you need options, and you need a plan B. And so far, Japan has simply pursued, it's kind of dabbled with Plan B, which is some kind of alternative to simply, defaulting to reliance on the United States. But it's lacked the courage to do that. So I would say, keep your Plan A, but you need a Plan B, which would be, in my view, would be, you have to work much harder to engage China on a variety of levels bilaterally, but also try and embed China within a kind of a deeper multilateral system within the region. And I would say I don't think that's a TPP. I think that's something more like an East Asian community.
Professor Saito, what do you think of that? Is A, do you agree with that? And B, if you do agree with it, does Japan have the ability to do that?
Well, because I was asked to talk about one specific piece of advice to the Prime Minister, let me talk about that in a different vein instead of simply agreeing or disagreeing with Chris. So my suggestion for the prospective Prime Minister is to avoid politicization of history.
Of the what?
Politicization of history issues. Let the academics debate it. Simply avoid talking about history as Mayor Kawamura did.
Because there's a dead end, you think? It's not going to get you anywhere. It's only going to
it's not
a bilateral relationship. You're going to score points, but you're going to lose the game. Very good. That's a good. Toshiaki, you want you get ready with your questions.
Well, to tell you the truth, I have the same piece of advice as Professor Saito. Don't play the nationalism card. But I have thought of a new one. That is, I will advise the Prime Minister to take a longer-term view on China. China may be a threat, but unstable China is going to be a much larger, much bigger threat. So watch carefully what China, how Chinese economy and politics will develop. That would be my advice.
Well, Professor Solis, you started first, and we're going to let you go last time. So, thank you for playing with me on this. I appreciate it.
It's a tough one, and I'm not sure I'm going to make sense at all, but I think my advice would be try to make sure that you balance both sides, that you don't have one withdrawing, and I think you have more leverage if you play that mediating role. And I think my concern would be that the United States does not have a staying presence in the region, because you're going to get less leeway with China if you are just talking to China on your own. So I'm really looking forward to debating this question as to whether TPP or East Asian community in more detail. But just as a Thies, I would say that the way to more genuine regional integration in East Asia, I'm not suggesting Japan leaves East Asia. On the contrary, Japan gets deeper into East Asia, but the way you get a more high-quality integration is via the TPP, because that will give Japan more leverage. So again, emphasize the cooperative aspects, emphasize economic interdependence, but make sure that you get the benefits of operating between two suns and not have one actually fade away.
I was really pleased in your answer because you picked up the metaphor of the two suns. And in terms of balance, and I've used that metaphor in my classes at UCLA and now at LMU, and it really helps the students understand that something profound is going on right now. And I did not ask you an easy question, for which I am totally unapologetic. Did you want to take the mic? There you go, sir. And now we're in the Q&A period, so make sure you have some questions, because if you don't, I do.
Oh, they do.
Good.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. Thanks for that wonderful presentation. I have a question about this political instability at the top. So I guess it's primarily addressed to Jun and also Toshiaki, but I think it pretty much underlies all the other international issues as well. For example, the ability of Japan to sign trade agreements, as well as come to strengthen the U.S.-Japan relationship as well. But this is kind of a political sciencey type of question, which your explanation for why at the top there's such instability. Is this working still? Yeah, sort of. There's this sort of electoral system literature out there, and so one of the predictions from this electoral system change that happened was that there would be less instability, because instability was partly driven by factions that were an outgrowth, and also the policy-making process was decentralized, given the incentives created by electoral system. But then we've had this electoral system, and now more than, nearly a decade has passed, and so that doesn't seem to be really accounting for why there's such instability at the top. And when I teach this in my Japanese politics section of my Asia politics course, I kind of always reach this point and say we have this instability at the top, and we need more research on this topic because we don't understand it very well. So I was really fascinated to hear your kind of initial description of why we are getting this instability at the top. So I'd like to hear some more about that, the notion of time horizons, as well as also this bicameral parliamentary system.
Because, it's interesting while you're thinking how to answer this very good question. It's interesting because if you look at Japan, I mean, they have brilliant heads of multinational corporations, brilliant journalists. I mean, the quality of Japanese journalism is very, very good. Brilliant entrepreneurs and entertainers and so on and so forth, and the most dismal political class in a certain way. Tired and corrupt. Who wants to answer that question?
Perhaps.
Well, I would like to add a couple of additional explanations for the instability. One is that if you compare Japanese party politics with UK, in UK, a prime minister stays as the top leader of the party until the next election. But in Japan, each party has its own rules about the length of the term of the party leader. So once you were elected as party leader and you won a general election, but if you have only 10 months left before that term expires, even though you have 4 full years before the next election, you have to stand and run for the re-election. And there are some discussion in Japan that people in both parties have realized that this is something very inconvenient, but they have not yet changed the rules. So it is a kind of built-in structure problem of Japanese political parties. I think that may come from the old LDP rule days, when each faction fights within LDP. So even in the LDP days, the length of the term of prime minister is not very long on international standard. That's because that depends on the power structure of factional politics within the LDP. So I think that still lingers on in Japanese politics today. That's maybe an additional explanation for the instability.
It's interesting, when I interviewed late Keizo Obuchi when he was prime minister, he complained about exactly that point. He said as president of the LDP, he could stay only for 5 years, but he didn't know if he would get 5 years. But if he got 5 years, that's all he would get. Whereas an American president who did well, or wasn't opposed well, would get a second term. And so he came right to that point. That was one of the debilitating factors in the system. That maybe that has to change.
Yeah, let me add a few things to explain political instability in Japan. So in addition to the rule of elections, there are several other things like campaign regulations, which very easily lead any politicians to lose their office. The Japanese electoral law is highly complicated, and regulators, especially the police agency and the Ministry of Home Affairs, can abuse the rule to oust any politicians they do not like. The mass media can be part of the game, and Japanese politicians can lose office out of mishandling of a very small amount of money, which is not comparable to money politics in the United States, for instance. So I think we need to take a look at the nasty transactions in the media and the bureaucracy, which might be abusing the current electron-related regulations, in addition to what I mentioned previously.
This question is more towards Christopher Hughes, but I'm not going to exclude anyone else if they have any thoughts on it. I have a question regarding Japan's security challenges. You mentioned that you wanted to strengthen the U.S.-Japanese security alliance. However, considering Obama's current foreign policy and that we're not going to get heavily involved via our troops and we should have a multilateral approach, which was demonstrated in Libya, how is Japan going to solve the issue of China militarizing and being really aggressive towards India, especially over oil trade routes?
Good luck. That's a heck of a question.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good question. But I mean, we'll still have to maybe need to backtrack and look at what Obama's kind of Asia policy really is in terms of security. We haven't really quite seen it as yet. I mean, we have this this document which came out it's like last month, which talked about the kind of the sort of revamping of U.S. security strategy and this sort of pivot towards East Asia. How far the U.S. really pivots, we'll have to see in terms of its change of its security strategy. So we're not really quite sure. It's still somewhat opaque, really, what the Obama administration is planning. But I don't think it's entirely. I do think the Obama administration is very serious about East Asia, and I think what it intends in East Asia is quite different from what it's the kind of. I don't think it's very analogous with what's happened, for instance, in some kind of more localized conflicts in the Middle East and Libya and so on. That was one where the US was quite happy to leave that to the Europeans with some support, but because it really wasn't the kind of core national security interest to the United States. I think what we're talking about in the Asia Pacific region is really kind of fundamental sort of level of sort of power politics, which really cuts to the very kind of continuation of the United States as a hegemonic regional power. So really what the United States, I think, is, what the Obama administration is talking about is really a security strategy as it pivots towards East Asia, which is designed to fundamentally maintain United States dominance of the region militarily, and therefore to face down the kind of growing military threat from China. So I think it's a kind of different magnitude, really, what the United States is planning in the Asia Pacific. And in that instance, I think the United States is very serious about intervention, or trying to restore the balance of power and to maintain its superiority in the region militarily. So in that sense, I don't think Japan is alone. I mean, I think the United States is very serious about maintaining a strong alliance with Japan, but also likewise beginning to network that alliance with a lot of other alliance relationships in the region. With Australia, with South Korea, with India as not an ally but a partner, and so on. So I think Japan can draw a lot of confidence that the alliance will remain pretty strong on those kinds of issues. So obviously, one thing Japan is really worried about, I think the two key security issues that Japan is worried about vis-a-vis China is obviously its own territory, and Senkaku's East China Sea and so on. And I think Japan can draw assurance from the United States that the US will back Japan in those issues. And then, of course, the second issue is maritime security. As you talk about sea lane security through East China Sea, South China Sea, and into the Indian Ocean and so on. And again, I think this is an area where we'll see actually quite a lot of developing US-Japan cooperation. We're already seeing it. We're already seeing it in terms of Japan's dispatch of the sort of precedents that it's set in terms of dispatching destroyers to the Indian Ocean. Of course, for anti-piracy activities, but again, it's all rehearsing sea lane security, showing presence vis-a-vis China, creation of Japan's first overseas military base in Djibouti. Of course, Japan Ministry of Defense won't kind of acknowledge that, but nevertheless, it's all this showing presence and doing that alongside the United States and doing that alongside US allies and partners. So, in that sense, I think Japan, it will become, it can certainly, alongside the United States, secure its key kind of core security interests. I don't know if that answers your question entirely, but that's where I think Japan is heading in terms of some of the cooperation with the US.
We could add just three things to that too. One is you've got to remember that we don't have a security relationship with Libya or Syria or any of those countries. We have security relationship with Japan and with South Korea. That's a really big difference. That's the first thing. Secondly, you have to keep in mind that from the Chinese perspective, if anything, we were looking more muscular lately than ever, and they would prefer us to be less muscular. So somewhere between your worries and Japanese perceptions is where the United States seems to be repositioning itself, and I think the repositioning is quite serious. The third thing to keep in mind, and panelists may disagree on this, but I'm originally from New York, and we have a phrase when we want to say somebody is really not so bad after all, we say he's not exactly chopped liver. The Japanese military is not exactly chopped liver, which is to say it is one of the most modern military in the world, and the Chinese military is not yet ready to take over the world. And if you want to invade China, right, that would be stupid beyond belief. But in terms of their Air Force and their Navy, particularly their one aircraft carrier is not going to win any prizes. Okay? I mean, they're not there yet. And I have written a column, and I said if I were the Chinese military, I would not at this point look to have a fight with the Japanese military, because at some point, the Japanese are going to be irritated and might actually do something, and that could be an embarrassment to China. So Japan is not yet, like Sri Lanka. So we're not there yet, and it's going to be a while.
Well, I think maybe Japan is in the process of disappearing. Then I think the American panelists caution that do better, avoid marginalization and so forth. So you're encouraging Japan to do better performance, and that is encouraging. But since Japan has been in the protection by US for so many decades, the politicians do not have any confidence in themselves. They have a notion that, okay, any important issue will be solved by the US, so we don't have to think about it. And this dependence is really the cause of deterioration of the Japanese politicians. Unless Japan is able to defend the country by themselves, no great politician would emerge in the country. So the first thing for Japan to be performing better in international politics is Japan has to have its own, say, self-defense force. Well, technically it has self-defense force, but it's not good enough at this moment. So I wonder how a panelist would think about.
That is the last question before the long-awaited coffee and tea break, I'm told by Michael. So who wants to take that?
Do you want to do it? Okay.
You got it.
It's a tough question. I think I can answer in two ways. One way is that people's sentiment really swings from one end to the other. I remember about 20 years ago, Japanese were overconfident that we would be number one in 21st century. But now we had a sense in Japan that we are losing our position in the world. We might be disappearing. I think these are the two extremes. I think one nation cannot change so rapidly from one end to the other. So the truth lies maybe in the middle. And I would like to, particularly the Japanese people who are now over-pessimistic, to really look upon what we have, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the nation. This is my first answer. And the second answer is that whether will it really work to have self-sufficient forces in Japan, in that archipelago country, and in East Asia, surrounded by China, Russia, and volatile Korea. I think Yoshida Shigeru, when he formed an alliance with the United States, I remember he saying or writing somewhere that nowadays it is impossible for one country to defend itself by oneself. So I think still that lesson still holds truth, and I think it's still much better to think in a more bilateral or multilateral framework. So I don't think self-sufficient U.S. forces will really, improve Japan's position.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to. I kind of second what. Is that on? Can you hear me? Yeah, I'd like to sort of second what Miura-san's saying. Really, I do agree with somewhat the purport of the question that, as you may have guessed, I think that Japan, there's kind of unhealthy dependency in Japan on the United States at times. It's kind of like an addiction. It's bad for you, but it's quite hard to kind of kick it. And I think Japan does need to develop more of a sense of the value of its own autonomy. And I think actually I'm not quite as pessimistic about the ability of Japanese policymakers to do that. I think we can see it. We are seeing a kind of younger generation of Japanese policymakers who are beginning to stretch their strategic horizon somewhat in terms of thinking about the possibilities, at the very least, for how Japan should behave in this more kind of fluid international environment. But as yet, they haven't really had the courage, or they haven't had the opportunity as yet, or really been fundamentally kind of obliged to actually act upon these kind of instincts, because they have been able to kind of default to reliance on the United States. But that won't always be the case, and I think they will have to progressively more and more think about how Japan can pursue a greater measure of autonomy. But I would agree very strongly with Miura-san that autonomy doesn't mean, or greater autonomy doesn't mean sort of abrogation of the US-Japan alliance, or build up very significant military forces, independent military forces. I don't think Japan can afford it. It can't defend itself. It simply cannot defend itself in that region unless it's prepared to spend huge amounts of its national treasure on nuclearization and so on and so forth. And this is really, I think, not a realistic prospect.
That, Christopher, but a lot of people would not welcome it.
Right. It's not a realistic prospect in terms of resources Japan has available, or I think domestic opinion. So Japan does have to, it does have to work very closely with other partners and with the United States as its ally. But it's got to calibrate that very, very carefully, so that it doesn't become, as I say, it doesn't become just Plan A the whole time. And there is always a Plan B, not just in security terms, but also a kind of countervailing set of diplomatic and economic relations as well.
Why don't we break on that note, and when we come back, Professor Solis will unveil her master plan, TPP master plan for the future of Japan. Let's have some coffee and tea. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Thank you. I agree. It's the worst.
Yeah.
Chilly?
Yeah, it's very chilly here.
If anyone falls asleep, we'll turn the air
Professor Solis? We want to reconvene. Michael, are we supposed to stop at 6? Yeah. We're very happy that there were so many questions, so many hands in the air. What a great. Sometimes these kinds of things you drive people to ask the first question or two. We didn't have to do that at all, and I know we didn't answer all the questions, so we'd like to do that. But if you don't mind, I'd like to suggest that Chris Solis was a very classy lady in the first half as we were talking about some things, and I know she has an overarching view, I think, of what would be a good idea for Japan to kind of have a more solid footing in the future. And so why don't we let her lay that out a little bit, and we comment on that. Not too much, because we don't want to cut off the questions, and then we'll go back to the audience. Is that all right? Okay.
Well, thank you. This is a real treat to get that.
Moderator,
Yes.
when you speak, could you speak at the mic? And when you put your
You can't hear me?
outside, it's hard to hear.
How do you know I want you to hear me? Oh, I will do that. I apologize.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I want to go back to this discussion that, it hasn't been made explicit yet, and I want to address it head on as to what should Japan do vis-a-vis Asia-Pacific integration or East Asia integration, because I think we could have great interactions that way. And I would like to start making the pitch for the TPP. And first of all, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Let me tell you what I meant by saying that this could be a game changer. There are today close to 500 free trade agreements that have been notified to the World Trade Organization. And many of them are, quite frankly, inconsequential. And many of them actually are very low quality and achieve very little. And the TPP, among 500 so agreements, stands out for two main reasons. One is that it has the potential or the promise of doing what has not been done before in two areas. First of all, to have no tolerance to the exclusion of sensitive commodities. This is usually one of the cardinal sins that countries are very comfortable negotiating agreements, and it's a cozy thing, and you set aside the sensitive sectors and you don't get to the heart of it. And the TPP has made the promise that it will not go this way. The other thing that it's doing that many free trade agreements do not do is that tariffs are the old issue. They're not as important anymore. Countries or governments protect their economies now through non-tariff barriers, and the TPP is trying to tackle them head on. So I see great promise in the TPP. I think that it's not a done deal. It could collapse. It might not move forward. And I think that the United States actually is perhaps one of the countries that, because of its domestic politics, has done things that may undermine the essence of the TPP by, quite frankly, still setting aside sugar. It's incredible, the political clout of sugar, that the U.S. has decided to set it aside, and in that way could compromise what is the essence of a TPP. But it's not a done deal. And I think that if we think about what has been in other free trade agreements, this is a qualitatively different ballgame altogether. Now, why I think it's good for Japan in particular? I think that we have a great experiment in front of our eyes. You see at what was going on in East Asian regionalism before the TPP became the hot potato it is today. It was not, I would make the case, not coalescing. Because Japan, China, and ASEAN had very different views on how to move on this. So far we have tons of bilateral agreements in the region, and we do not have yet an ongoing, real-time negotiation about an East Asian-wide trade agreement. There's been more progress in the area of finance and in the area of trade. And why it was not coalescing? Again, because countries are very far apart on what they want to do for this region, who should be included, and what should be the terms of integration. And I would make the case that perhaps now with the TPP, there will be stimulus to pursue a higher quality integration in East Asia. I think Prime Minister Noda put it really well when he, on the eve of the TPP announcement, said there will be chemical reactions. And I think we've been watching those reactions unfold on three key areas. Japan has gained leverage it did not have before. Before Japan announced its interest in the TPP, the European Union had been very coy about really sitting down to negotiate a trade agreement with Japan. The EU is now going to initiate those negotiations with Japan. Before Japan announced its interest in the TPP, China had also not been enthusiastically looking forward to signing a trilateral agreement between China, Korea, and Japan. Those negotiations are now going to start. Before Japan announced its interest in the TPP, China had not agreed to Japan's own formula for East Asian integration, which is the ASEAN +6. China was pushing for the ASEAN +3. The difference being that these 3 extra members are Australia, India, and New Zealand. 3 democracies, 3 countries with high standard agreements for liberalization. So I do think that Japan actually gained a lot just by announcing, just by trying more seriously to be part of the TPP. And at the end of the day, I think that if Japan comes to negotiate an agreement with China, which would be wonderful, should be pursued, a trilateral and East Asian-wide FTA should be there by all means. But I think Japan will have the ability to push for a higher quality agreement that tackles those non-tariff barriers. Because otherwise, I think the risk we're going to run is that these countries might put something together that will be very low quality, and again will be one of those 500 agreements in the WTO that do not get the traction to make these real significant.
Beautifully put, and with a little passion. Christopher, do you have a different view?
Yeah, I do somewhat have a different view. Yeah, I mean, I think Mireya's analysis is in many ways excellent. I wouldn't kind of disagree with it. But I tend to look at these FTAs much more in a sort of from a political point of view, sort of leaving aside, the benefits for economic revitalization and so on. I tend to think of FTAs as essentially really political mechanisms, and what are the political implications beyond just economic cooperation. I guess I think if Miura's in theory, I think it's good. The whole idea of sort of competitive regionalism, how that's going to spark kind of a kind of sort of virtuous cycle of sort of liberalization, and hopefully that might kind of give some momentum to East Asian regionalism. But I'm kind of more skeptical, really. I mean, I do wonder whether fundamentally the TPP and the sort of East Asian regionalism are really sort of fundamentally whether they're compatible long term because of the politics behind them. If you look at it in a political light, I think TPP comes from a kind of different tradition of East Asian regionalism, and it is Asia Pacific led form of potential regional integration. And when we say Asia Pacific, we mean fundamentally it's going to become a US-led mechanism for driving forward regional integration, because once the US gets involved, and we can already see this, the US is already beginning to kind of run the show somewhat in the TPP. And I think this is part of this larger pivot towards Asia from the United States. I mean, the US is becoming more engaged. Politically, it's beginning to kind of penetrate East Asia through the East Asian Summit. Economically, the TPP is the kind of foundation for sort of economic re-engagement and setting the rules of the game in East Asia, but will be an Asia-Pacific rules of the game, essentially driven by the United States. And then in security terms, of course, it's trying to revitalize bilateral alliances and interconnectedness of those alliances. So it's kind of part of a building block, a really political agenda, I think, which is behind that in order to reassert US dominance in the region. And of course, China, to some extent, can go along with this. And I think Miura's analysis is right. What it has done is kind of jump China into a sort of more flexible posture towards Japan and try and sort of pull Japan back into, or sort of restart negotiations, sort of through the sort of Northeast Asia sort of free trade agreement or East Asia free trade agreement mechanism. But I really wonder how far this can run. I think fundamentally, because I think China fundamentally sees that really the TPP is about, again, US assertion of dominance over the region. This is really the kind of US power play. And I don't think China is really going to live with this. And TPP in many ways runs counter to the whole tradition of East Asian regions, which we can critique as in many ways very ineffective. But the important thing was that it is East Asian regionalism. The East Asians themselves were trying to articulate sort of forms of cooperation which were free of, just running along the old lines of defaulting to U.S. leadership. And we did have a mechanism, potential mechanism in the East Asian community idea, which has been criticised as some people say is vacuous and so on, and Hatoyama's talk about UI and all that kind of stuff. But actually, if you look at what the East Asian community, some of the ideas that were beginning to emerge, they're very much kind of based on quite sound principles of trying to build up sort of key areas of functional cooperation, which would involve participation by all East Asian states and a set of norms and sort of issue areas that they could all sign up to and actually cooperate amongst themselves. And I think that runs counter to really what the TPP is about, which is really essentially, again, it's a US-led, exclusionary, discriminatory trading framework. And there's a fundamental clash there with what I think the East Asians are trying to do in terms of their own regional aspirations. And I think it's a fundamental clash with what China would like to do in terms of trying to somewhat sort of lessen the grip of the United States on shaping the regional agenda. So I think Japan's going to end up caught in the middle. Maybe that will give Japan more leverage. Maybe it'll be able to sort of intermediate between China and the United States. But I think what will happen is actually Japan will just get pulled more into the US sphere, and it will abandon the opportunities for cooperation with China through the East Asian community idea. So I think actually what Japan is doing is it's a dangerous game, TPP. I can see the economic benefits maybe to sort of revitalize the Japanese economy, but I think in political terms, Japan runs the risk of being sucked into, once again, this kind of US-led agenda and passing up the opportunities for cooperation with China, because I think China fundamentally is going to have a lot of difficulties with the whole idea of the TPP, as are a number of other East Asian states, and you're going to lead to this kind of fragmentation of regional cooperation.
May I just ask my Toshiaki and Professor Saito if you would comment on the political dimensions of this issue, because I have to say, as a reporter, a columnist for the LA Times in the 90s, I perhaps got too close to the viewpoint of the U.S. trade representative in the bilateral negotiations with Tokyo over structural impediments and all that, and I am very overly informed on the lobby problem and the constituency problems that support LDP and so on and so forth. So what about the political? I mean, it can look great on paper and make a lot of theoretical sense, but is there the will and their leadership within Japan to pull this off?
I would like to say a few words about the domestic political aspects of the TPP. Despite its importance in the agenda, I think very little attention has been paid in the media, in the political world. So when TPP became a hot issue last year, before the Honolulu APEC, some people say, what does TPP stand for? Many people don't understand. Some people say TPP stands for, in Japanese, 突然パッと出てきた project, which means project which appears suddenly like a bolt out of the blue. But I think it's true. And nowadays, people now paying very little attention to the TPP. People are now paying attention to the infighting of the DPJ and so many things. Despite the importance of this role and meaning in the Japanese political economy, I think strangely politicians do not like to talk it very much. So I'm paying very much attention to how they can solve the domestic aspect, domestic coordination. Because since the textile dispute days, the usual way of the Conservative Party is to give money to the affected areas. But Japan is no longer an affluent country. So where can we get money to give it to the affected areas, farmers and people in the affected, fields? So this is something I'm very cautiously watching.
It's interesting. China faced a slightly, or maybe not so slightly, comparable decision with regard to WTO in whether to go into WTO and crack open some of the barriers internally, and it didn't do it completely, but it did it enough to get in. So it really could be a kind of Rubicon kind of decision for Japan.
Yeah, let me talk a little bit more about electoral politics behind the TPP negotiation. But before that, let me point out that if the government is short of money, let the Bank of Japan print more money. Because Japan has been going into chronic deflation for a long time, it's largely attributable to the Bank of Japan's tight monetary policy. So I'd say that monetary expansion would at least solve some of the problems, especially the currency appreciation. And if you take a look at the electoral politics behind TPP, who are against the negotiation? Farmers? Well, people tend to criticize farmers as opposing any sort of trade negotiation. But in addition to the farmers, we see a kind of coalition between farmers, small businesses, and doctors, all against the TPP. Previously, when we were discussing WTO as well as GATT, trade liberalization, it was only the rice farmers who were targeted. But this time, it appears that there seems to be a coalition among different groups of economic sectors. Because Japan's tariff rates, except for a few important agricultural commodities, have already been fairly low, the benefits in terms of trade liberalization will be only marginal. But there will be restructuring of medical as well as welfare regimes. There will be affected parties. And in order for the Japanese government to build up a coalition in favor of the TPP, I think the government will need to wage a sort of compensation package. Previously, the Japanese government was notorious for building a particularistic targeted compensation package. In the case of orange trade liberalization, the government expanded pork barrel projects in Wakayama and Ehime prefecture. That's the way the Japanese government previously coped with trade liberalization negotiations. In the future, I would say that the Japanese government will need to wage more universalistic compensation package to build up trade liberalization reforms. That said, I think what will matter more to revitalize the Japanese economy is again what to do with the currency appreciation, and the monetary policy will be the key.
Should we go back to questions now, or how do you want to do this, Michael? What's that? Another topic, okay. Well, to me, Japan has, as an observer from Los Angeles, has kind of waxed and waned in terms of, it's a very international place, but in its heart, whether it wants to be Japan or Japan International. I remember I taught a course, thanks to the largesse of NHK in 1999, from UCLA to Kyoto University, and it was live cable television because the internet wasn't good enough then, and it cost about $1,000 a minute or something like that. But NHK wanted to do it because at that point in '99, they just felt that Japan had to reach out more and internationalize more and so forth. And then the course was given, and we were actually 3 at UCLA. I taught one of the 3. And the overall evaluation, they were very successful. We should do it again. And then the next year, NHK said, well, we don't have the money to do it, so we won't do it. And Japan sort of said, well, maybe we don't need to reach out that much. Is that kind of existential question still at the core of the psychological drama in Japan, or is my view dated? What does Japan want to be in 20, 40, 50 years? Thank you.
Well, I think I can observe two trends. One trend is that, as you pointed out, people are getting more and more inward-looking. Japanese young people are more reluctant to go and study abroad and things like that. But the other aspect is that I can still see, not many, but some individuals who are really, more adventurous and who are taking more risks. And so I was at Harvard in 2009 and 2010 as a researcher, and I came across a couple of Japanese people, young students who entered Harvard. One is from Nada High School. Nada High School is the most prestigious high school who is proud of sending many pupils, graduates to Tokyo University. The one I met was really a brilliant student, and even in his 10th grade, he got already achieved such enormous academic skills to pass medical department of Tokyo University. Then he thought that it is no longer interesting. He thought he would like to take a challenge. And then he applied for Harvard and Yale, and he succeeded and got scholarships from both universities. Then what happened is that the principal and the teacher came to his house asking his parents to please do not go to Harvard. Please send him to Tokyo University, just to increase the esteem of the high school. But the student refused. There are not many, but I can see some students who really think more internationally. So I think what's happening is both trends. The problem with the Japanese system is that now the Japanese companies' recruitment system is very, very clumsy, very bad one that, particularly third-year students, junior students have to spend a lot of time, applying and going through a kind of a screening system and things like that. So before that, it was quite natural for junior year students to spend 1 year abroad, just like junior year abroad program. And actually, when I was a junior abroad program, I also took 1 year off and went to London School of Economics. But that kind of, opportunity is very difficult to achieve during the present system. So I think there are some structural problems, and that can be solved.
Yeah, wouldn't the fact that China is sending students all over the world, all over the place, scare the hell out of you guys, and you loosen up on that?
Well, one thing is that, this is not a joke, but I think many Japanese people feel more comfortable to live in Japan, to stay in Japan, while maybe for the many Chinese students, it's much more advantageous to go and study abroad, particularly at the best schools in the UK or in the United States.
Related to that, there was a study that was done at the University of Hong Kong of Chinese students who took summer vacations somewhere in Asia and asked them to evaluate their experiences and rate the country that they liked the most. And despite everything, it was always Japan at the top.
If I can jump into that discussion, in my introductory remarks, I talked about the importance of nurturing internationalized human capital and the fact that this has come as a surprise. We had this Mansfield Foundation task force, people from academia, from government, from business, that would like to make U.S.-Japan economic relations, to improve them, to expand them, to take them to a new level. And again, that it really became very significant, and I think this is going to be one of the most important recommendations we make when there's near universal consensus, that the fact is that we need these human capital, and that in both countries we see trends that point in a different direction. And this became evident just as we were all introducing ourselves, and everyone in that table had spent time in Japan, had benefited from a program that brought us there, or our Japanese counterparts had done the same thing. And I think this raised a number of issues. One is that we're talking about human exchanges that are costly. At a time when both countries have severe debt and budget and fiscal issues, and therefore it becomes harder to sustain. We also have to talk about wide-ranging incentives, and it's not just about government programs and whether the government is going to try to cut the JET, this program that brings Americans to teach English in Japan or not, but also, as Miura-san was saying, corporations are very much also changing their ways in a manner that makes it harder for students to think about study abroad. We also heard, because we went to Tokyo and talked to many different people, how people who had actually gone to the United States, very ambitious people and so forth, when they come back, they feel isolated. They become strange in terms of the corporate culture, and they find that their promotion within the company is not helped and the country is hindered. So we're really trying to get at these multidimensional phenomena, because we came to the conclusion that, again, if you're going to have a strong group of people vouching for this relationship, there must be that formative experience. And it's very difficult sometimes for politicians in periods of tight budgetary situations to see the benefits long term. But I think that, indeed, if we want for both of these countries to do well, this should be a priority.
That's one thing to add. And now one of the hot topics, latest news in Japan, is that some of the best universities are thinking of changing school calendar so that the school starts in fall, so that there would be more exchange students from abroad.
Yeah, let me jump into this discussion of internationalization of the Japanese mind. I always refer to the declining number of Japanese students studying abroad as an indication of inward-looking posture. But if we really closely take a look at what was going on behind the figure, we may actually be witnessing emergence of close substitutes to the U.S. education in the Japanese domestic educational industry. I recently corresponded with the head of the Waseda University's international programs, and he mentioned that more than 500 courses at Waseda University are now taught in English. So there seems to be emergence of close substitutes of American or British higher education in Japan. Well, there's certainly criticism about professors' English language proficiency. And that said, I still think that English language education in Japan is rubbish. And I'm also partly a victim of that old-fashioned pedagogy. So I think there needs to be certainly some forms of reforms going on. But still, gradually and slowly, the Japanese educational institutions and the practice of education are changing.
This lady's like a question. She's got her hand up for hours and hours. Go ahead.
Maybe everybody get angry with me, because I always said this and everybody upset. But I think most important things, we have to eliminate keigo. You know,
eliminate cable?
Keigo. That is honorary. Because we have to always judge people up and down. And then, you know, when Japanese go outside, they cannot judge. So they become withdraw. You know, we are so used to use, you know, our judgment is this guy is above me or down. That since, you know, 12th century, I learned Tales of Genji. I had to, you know, assault Keigo, this level person in, you know, the aristocrats, the definite honorary words there. We have to all assault those. I studied Japanese literature. I was so sick of it, so I came to America. That's what the problem is, language problem. So the way of thinking become automatically, maybe we shouldn't say this way. So that's why we can't do equal position to negotiate with outsiders. You know, I learned by my marriage, so.
Any marriage counselors on the panel want to take that? Huh? Chris, you have anything you want to say on that? Anybody? We have an opening for another question. Yeah, good. Don't be shy, anybody.
I've been enjoying this panel very much, thank you. I have two questions. I guess one is kind of relation to overall kind of these points that you raised and kind of a theme of this panel overall. And also I have the second question, which are things that's not being explicitly said, but it's really in the kind of major background. And my first question is related to the legitimacy of Japan. And I can see from all the discussions that balancing, hedging, so on and so forth, be it kind of a reactive way of dealing with the changing situation, or maybe strategic way of kind of creating a better position for Japan. But all that kind of means that Japan is not set, right? And all the time in the past, what we've been hearing about the Japanese foreign policy is so-called legitimacy deficit. Japan is like a bat, it's not an animal, but it's not a bird, and it goes back and forth depending on the situation. And I wonder, yes, maybe it's a strategically wise choice to be hedging and balancing, but what does it mean for Japan if it was to be one of the leaders, if not the leader, in the region to set any rules or guidelines or the kind of a leadership in creating a new future for the region overall, or the country, for the region overall? So that's my first question.
So hold on to your second. That's the big one. Who wants to take on that? Yes, great.
Talking about legitimacy, I think we are in a position to talk about perception of Japan in the outside world. And if you take a look at BBC's survey about about the images of countries in the world, Japan is actually performing pretty well, except for China and Korea. So I would say that historical reconciliation will be the most important ones in terms of Japan's relations with its neighbors. But in the outside world, Japan doesn't have a negative image as China does in Europe or in other developing countries. The Japanese foreign aid programs, I think, in this respect, worked pretty well in the past.
Chris?
I'm not quite sure if this is what Saudi was asking, but I mean, I agree with Jun that Japan's gone a long way to kind of recovering its negative image in the world, but I think, so in the sense that most people would agree, with the exceptions of South Korea and China, especially in Europe, that Japan is a kind of nice country. But that's about it, So in other words, it's a nice country, but it's left people kind of, I wouldn't say indifferent to Japan, but certainly in a sense they have no vision of what Japan is actually trying to do in the world. And I think that maybe that's your question, is kind of does Japan have really a kind of vision of where it would like to locate itself, what it actually wants to do? And likewise, you see this in debate about Japan's, wanting to get a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It's like, well, why? What do you actually want to do? What role do you want to play? And you kind of ask, Japanese policymakers that. They say, well, we want to, contribute to world peace and stability. Well, of course, right? But what is it you actually want to do? Do you want to be? Do you have a kind of, some kind of independent view of how you'd like to structure the world? The world order. Are you dissatisfied in any way with the world order? How do you want to change it? And I think that's a kind of, that's really something which is quite elusive in the Japanese context. It's very hard to sort of put your finger on really what is the Japanese worldview beyond, I think, which is behind your question, which is kind of basically getting by, right? And I think that's where Japan really lacks a vision. I'm not saying all countries have such a strong vision. The US obviously does have a strong vision.
But it's a bad one.
well, no, but you know what the US role is, right? We know what the US is trying to do. We even know what my own country, the UK, is trying to do. Sometimes it's very badly, but I think the UK has a vision of itself. Mm-hmm. Sometimes outdated, but it certainly sees itself. It's kind of vision. European Union even has a vision, despite its kind of mess. But what is Japan's vision? Being nice, right? Trying to get by. That's not bad, to get by without too much conflict with your neighbors. That's not bad. But, if you're talking about leadership, if that's your question, well, in that sense, there's a deficit in terms of real kind of Japan's view of the world, how we'd like to see the world. It's kind of elusive, I think.
If you look at the totality of Japan, what it has produced, a nation of 170 million, the population of Japan, it's extraordinary. And therefore, you've heard of the phrase, certain countries punch above their weight, like Singapore probably punches above its weight. Australia only has 20 million people and a lot of kangaroos, punches above its weight. Japan probably punches below its weight when you consider. And you say, well, what does Japan stand for? Well, to me, I've never been confused about that. To me, it's always, I use the word ichiban. Whenever it goes into something seriously, it generally excels. If you look at the areas where it said we have to be number one in, it has become number one in. But where they haven't become number one is in world leadership, world participation, and diplomacy. And before I go any further with that, I must tell you just a little story because I find it so charming. But in 1999, when I taught this course at UCLA with the Kyoto students, it was hard at first to get them to talk. And one of the reasons was they were brilliant kids, but they were embarrassed about their English. And they thought that the English wasn't ichiban. And I was saying, we don't care, we're Americans, we don't care, we're sloppy, intellectually sloppy, and et cetera, relax. And finally we got them in to talk. And then finally I asked them at one point when they were actually talking to us and they were making very incisive observations. I asked them, I said, what is wrong? This is 1999 now. What is wrong with Japanese politics? So one brilliant Kyoto student stood up and said, well, what's wrong with Japanese politicians is they're all so old and ugly, And I said, my first reaction was to being a politically correct American to say, now you shouldn't judge anybody by their looks, And then I paused a minute and said, now wait a minute, these are smart, these are really smart kids. What are they really saying? I said, what do you really mean? He said, well. He says, you look at Clinton, was still our president then. Look at Clinton. He gets up and he's young, he's full of energy. He has a press conference, he really says something, and when it's over, something really happens. Our guys get up and they don't say anything, and when it's over, nothing ever happens. And I realized that to me, that was the fact that Japan had entered the television age with regard to its politics, and if you didn't look good on television, you weren't going to lead the nation, and guess who came along within a year or two? Koizumi. So I think that Japan is probably changing in ways that we don't realize because in some cases we're too close to it, in some cases we're too far from it. But I remember the sage of Singapore, I once asked him about Japan. And he said, well, I'll just say one thing, I wouldn't count Japan out yet. You have a second question, and then we'll go to you.
Yeah, second question is a very quick one. All the challenges that Japan has, the biggest, I think, is the demographic challenge. And I'm kind of surprised to see that no one has said anything about it. So, and it obviously relates to a lot of things that's been said, but it was such a, it was all implicitly kind of in the background. So I just wanted to.
Well, Japan has to let more people in.
Yeah, so that immigration is one. So when you talk about human capital, immigration, as well as the demographic shift and all that, and then fiscal position and all that is related too.
But that's part of the painful readjustment and change process that Japan has to go through. I mean, America, for all our faults, and we have a long list of them, but that, the one thing we really got right, and the genius of America was letting all kinds of people in who then had a whole lot of energy and changed the country, for the better. And until Japan does that, you're going to have that stagnation, I think.
Can I comment?
Yeah, sure. And tell the truth, because I don't know what I'm talking about. You go.
I mean, trying to tie in all these themes about can Japan lead an East Asian region and the demographic challenge and the immigration issue. I think that one of the problems, I think, is that, at least from a point of view of other East Asian countries, is that Japan is talking an arm's length integration, right? We send you the components, we send the companies, we send the managers abroad, but there is less of an intake. And I see that very dramatically happened with these agreements with Thailand and Philippines that brought the nurses to Japan. They counted like drops, and and put these very difficult Japanese language barriers, and a system that, you know that you need that kind of care, you need to bring these human resources, but Japan actually does not look like a leader and does not look like it wants to fully integrate with Asia. It actually looks like it's all out, and not bringing in from the region. So I think that hurts Japan's leadership position in Asia.
Well, if this woman is right, it could be decisive. Someone had a hand up there? Why don't we do the young lady and then we'll do the gentleman over there?
I wanted to ask, it seems pretty essential and inevitable that Japan has to globalize, integrate itself into the international community. So do you think that its need to globalize and integrate itself will change the internal structure of domestic politics, or does domestic politics have to change first in order for it to become an effective player in the international world?
Fearlessly he goes forward.
It's a tough question, but as a political journalist who observes domestic politics, my question is, Japan's internal political structure has to be changed, not only for Japan's globalizing role, but also for the Japanese people themselves. There are bunch of problems domestic problems in Japan, and all these problems are not addressed fully because of the instability. So I'm afraid I'm not answering directly to your question, but to the Japanese political observer, I think it's more serious matter, even on the domestic side.
I mean, yeah. But just let me, before I forget what I want, it's not 30 seconds, then you go. I mean, it seems to me Japan has to globalize. I mean, what's the question in a certain way? I mean, is it going to become North Korea in 40 years? I mean, but I mean, I agree, I understand it's a matter of degree, but I mean, what's the choice? I mean, it's not going to be able to compete globally if it becomes more insular.
I would actually like to change the direction of the conversation, in the sense that I think this happens a lot in Japan panels, that it's all about Japan's deficits or Japan's drawbacks or Japan's difficulties, and you get a very dire picture. And I was having this conversation with friends in the morning. What are the assets of Japan? What is the bright spot? And I think that it would be interesting to hear from everybody here, because otherwise we just get a list of, it's the unsurmountable demographic challenge, it's the incapacity to lead. And I think they're very tangible successes of Japan recently that should give us reason to actually also bring the strengths. And what I would suggest too, just if people want to continue with the discussion, but that actually came out in the aftermath of March 11, one I think is the resilience and the strength of civil society. I think that everybody was in awe to see that those affected areas, people did not go on rioting, and people were very disciplined, and there was a lot of solidarity vis-a-vis neighbors. And the other one, quite frankly, is the recovery of the supply chain against all odds in a relatively fast manner, and the fact that despite the fact that many of these nuclear reactors have shut down, you did not see the nightmare scenario of these rolling blackouts crippling the city. So I think that this ability to recover, to come back, and to have this sense of social cohesion is some things that we all should put on the table when you think about Japan's challenges. Well, these are some of the assets that Japan is bringing to address these challenges.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it is inherent in all panels to convene and discuss the problems, because if you didn't do that, you wouldn't need a panel. But for balance, I think you're absolutely right. I tried to address that in quoting Lee Kuan Yew and my own view about Japan. I think you're quite right. I guess we're particularly concerned about Japan, not only because we're here at this great place, but because we're Americans and we have a special relationship with Japan, so we care. Let's get the people who haven't asked a question, and then we'll go around second, third time. In the back, then we'll go to you, probably.
Hi, guys. I wanted to ask you what you thought about what companies are forward-thinking in Japan? What companies are kind of leading the way in terms of this internationalization, and how people like us might get involved? What are the action steps that someone like me, who wants to get back to Japan, who wants to work for a Japanese company that is, participating in this forward-thinking process, what are the action steps that someone like myself might be able to take? Or I don't know if anybody else here wants to get back to Japan or find a job with an American company that has a large presence in Japan. Maybe you guys could touch on that.
Anybody?
Sure. Because I participate in this task force, there were some conversations along those lines. Three groups of companies come to mind. What would be, there are some Japanese companies like Rakuten and Uniqlo who have embraced internationalization, and they're trying, for example, quite revolutionary steps like making English the dominant language in headquarters Tokyo. I mean, that's a steep challenge, and we'll see whether they can do it, but I think that the sentiment is huge, a change, and it's for the better. So that kind of company. The other one would be the usual suspects of foreign companies in Japan. And it was very interesting. We had a visit with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Tokyo, and they were the most gung-ho about the Japanese economy. They were telling us that 15 years before, they were the harshest critics of Japan, and they see so much potential. So I'm sure that if they see potential, they're hiring. And the other one, this is in D.C. I'm not sure here in the West Coast, but if it happens in D.C., it has to happen even more here. I've been very impressed, for example, with the Japanese Chamber of Commerce in DC, because they're running, in April, for example, they're having an event where they're bringing everyone that can talk to students like you who have perhaps some Japanese language training about what career opportunities could they find in the Japanese corporate world. And they're bringing all kinds of executives and other people, and they have panels and so forth to precisely provide that kind of guidance, with the sense that there is a payoff, because I think that the last thing that they want or that we want is that people write off Japan.
Professor Solis, for the average American college student who's ambitious to go to Japan and sort of make his or her way in Japan, is it an absolute prerequisite to be fluent in Japanese?
Well, I don't know if I think it would help a great deal. I think if you expect to get the subtleties and so forth, you need to, try and immerse yourself in the language. As much progress as these companies are trying to make in installing English, it's just a few, right? I mean, it's not going to be the mainstream practice, and it's a long way to go. I mean, they were telling us about this, but through translators. So that tells you that they're really trying to change things quite drastically, but they're not there yet.
Tell me also, the panel, if I'm wrong in this, and it wouldn't surprise me if I am, but my perception of Japan multinational corporations, MCOs, in the 90s was that they were many of them were most avant-garde, cutting-edge, international, smart, advanced, clever. We learn a million things from them, and the political establishment was a bunch of dogs. And, it's hard to believe that those two sectors came from the same society. Is that a, roughly speaking, correct perception?
Does anybody want to take that one?
Yeah, let me mention a group of forward-looking as well as backward-looking corporate or as well as government entities. Let me start with backward-looking entities. They are TEPCO, BOJ, Bank of Japan, Ministry of Finance.
Those are good?
Bad.
That's bad. Okay.
Let me mention a few things about remarkable forward-looking companies as well as non-profit entities, which are universities. Well, Rakuten and Uniqlo, I had the same opinion as Mireya's. And one small but growing company that came to my mind is Rare Job, which provides online English language education service, inexpensive service for Japanese consumers. The company's mission is to increase English-speaking population in Japan to 10 million, roughly 10% of the Japanese population. The way the company does the job is to hire students at the University of Philippines and have them carry out conversation with Japanese consumers online. By doing so, that company provides a inexpensive service. And the company's another mission is to cover the entire landmass of the Philippines within 15 minutes reach of ambulances, improving the quality of medical service in that country. That said, I think a rare job is a buy. And the following 5 universities are providing good educational service to the Japanese consumers. Waseda, Sophia, Akita International University, Asia Pacific Risumekan University in Oita, those are...
What about my Kyoto, no?
Kyoto and the University of Tokyo would belong to the backward looking, I'd say. I'd say that the Ministry of Education has too much tight control over the way the university is managed. There are smart, forward-looking people at the University of Tokyo as well as Kyoto University, but their reform efforts are often blocked by the red tapes of the government, unfortunately.
Well, you should be an advisor then to Mitt Romney when he runs for the presidency on the dangers of federalization. Yes, ma'am.
For TPP, if Japan would join TPP, then they should put Monsanto in. That the seeds for the Haiti government bought Monsanto seeds, and the second year it didn't work, so they have to buy again. And in India too, so many farmers committing suicide. So don't let Monsanto in. I'm sorry to say. But another thing, I have a question. Is there any newspaper which wrote about nuclear reactors coming in Japan, before coming in Japan, like Nakasone and Shoriki Matsutaro was doing that stage? Are there any explanation about how dangerous, of course everybody knows about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but young people didn't know.
I mean, was there any critical or cautionary journalism at the time?
We didn't see so much.
Right,
So,
right.
are there any newspaper?
Well, the Asahi has published, and is still publishing, a very long series of articles, now more than 100 articles on that topic, that why Japan...
No, she means before nuclear power became such a big deal in Japan, was there enough cautionary journalism about the safety issues?
Yeah, I'm actually talking about that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so we all reviewed the history from A-bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki up to now.
Not 1955.
Could you repeat your question again? I'm just saying that we have been reviewing the whole 65 years of how the media has reported nuclear energy.
And your conclusion was?
It's still going.
Yeah, but her question...
After Fukushima?
Yeah, I was censored.
There were. Actually, that was also covered. In 1970s, the Asahi and many newspapers, at least some newspapers are critical. But at a certain point in late 1970s, that changed. Partly because the pressure from the business side is very strong, and partly because, this is a very different question from other topics. Maybe I can give you an example. Well, for example, the Asahi Shinbun has been critical of the, self-defense force and U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, and we have been a very critical observer. Whereas in the atomic issues, we have not been so critical. Well, we were supportive, maybe from a certain point in 1970s. And why is the difference? I once asked our science reporter, why didn't you criticize nuclear energy? You are just following the government policy line? When it comes to the Article 9 or the Constitution and the security issues, the Asahi Shinbun and some other newspapers have been very critical of the government stance. Why? What's the difference? One answer from the writer who really analyzed all these backgrounds is that when it comes to constitution or security issue, we have a lot of prestigious scholars in Tokyo University and in every field who take the same stance, critical stance towards the security treaty and towards the right-wing and nationalism and so forth. But when it comes to science and nuclear energy issues, almost all their best and brightest people were all supportive, all support the nuclear energy industry. Otherwise, they can't get any jobs. So this is a kind of...
Can't get any job as journalists, you mean?
No, in nuclear energy. So this is a monopoly of just, all the expertise and all the scientists are all just following the same line, otherwise they can survive. Whereas in other fields, there are some rooms for, critics and for people who take other positions. So the nuclear issue is serious, more serious because it is not only a military industrial complex, as some people call it, but also it is academic complex. All the people in the same area are holding the same view. I think that kind of a structural problem is really hard. And when it comes to newspapers and broadcasting corporations, all the people who are doing science reporting are from Tokyo or Kyoto University. They are also a part of that establishment. So I think that explains some part of the question why the media are not very critical, have not been very critical before the Fukushima disaster.
If they are critical since 1955, then nobody builds that nuclear reactor.
Well, it's not so simple as that. I will give you I think it's more complicated because okay. I'll explain to you later. It's not so simple. The history is more complicated.
I do think that in the spirit of Professor Solis, that we should put this in some context, which is to say that I know of no national media that doesn't have blind spots and hasn't shown blind spots on major issues. And if we look at the media that I spent, for better or for worse, my career in, the American media, we have really missed big stories. I mean, the most obvious, of course, was that the American media swallowed hook, line, and sinker weapons of mass destruction vis-a-vis Iraq. I raise that not to be anti-Bush or to go back up to the Iraq War and so forth, but to make the point that even the great American media, as some people think it is, blows major issues. And it goes to a point that I make in class, in my classes, and my students back there will know, my one student back there will know, that there is no such thing as a free press, a totally free press. Every press, one way or another, pays a piper, and that piper will call a tune. I mean, I'll give you a trivial example. Will you ever see in the Los Angeles Times, which some people think is a pretty good paper, an investigative report on the sales practices of used car dealers? Well, you won't. Do you think that because used car dealers are uniformly honest and reliable and have great integrity? No, that's not the reason. How much used car advertising has Los Angeles Times? I mean, and I'm not saying it's a conscious decision. Now, his point, which is really a very interesting one, is a source's point, which I missed at first, but as I was listening to him, it's a brilliant point. What he's saying is that the journalists, even if they were trying to do an objective and balanced and even critical job of nuclear power, there weren't the sources to quote, that they had been, in effect, co-opted by this huge rush of money. That's another reason why they're, excuse my French, there ain't no such thing as a free press. It's just unfree in different ways. China is unfree in a certain way. Singapore is unfree in a certain way. I can tell you France is unfree in a certain way. We're learning a lot about the press on Fleet Street in London, how it was unfree in a certain way. So, I just put that in the spirit that we don't want to get into Japan bashing, although this was a big story that was missed. Yeah. Yeah.
I actually had a follow-up on this point. I found Miura-san's comment very interesting. I wonder if it might cast some light on the matter to think about the coverage of the nuclear issues in the 70s in the context of maybe something that Miura-san would be especially knowledgeable about, something within Asahi. I'm thinking of in the early 70s when the Asahi Janaru had an editorial board that at one point started to look towards problems with pharmaceuticals and started to look towards problems of pollution. And they got into trouble and they basically got fired and replaced with more cooperative people. I'm thinking of Kominami Yuichiro and his group. And the story I had from them, and I don't have another view on this, so I just had to take their word for it, was that basically the issue was advertising. These were touching on topics that for the entire Asahi corporation, whether it's car advertising or other things or pharmaceuticals, that had this threat to the bottom line, and that's why there was a reaction. So in that case, it wasn't that they couldn't find experts. They were putting out articles, but then they had to back off, and then the editorial board changed and the policies changed. I mean, not that they completely went away, but there was this thing happened. I wonder if that was a prefigurement for what you saw in nuclear coverage.
Well, advertisement is surely a very important element in journalism, in newspaper as business, but also this is a very complicated issue. In some cases, the editorial board rejects the complaints or from requests from the companies. In early 1980s, I think the economic news department has published a series of articles on banks, and they were not happy about it, and all the banks stopped advertisement until the whole series is over. But at that time, the Asahi didn't give in. But I think I have not yet enough evidence to talk about the nuclear issue, and our series on that problem is still going, but I have a sense that maybe in the nuclear case, maybe the advertisement might be a bigger factor than the issue of banks. But I'm not quite sure. I cannot say a definite account yet. But it really, works in the balance. Whether if the newspaper are selling well and is in a very good financial position, maybe they can reject the advertisements. But when it's in bad shape, particularly for their local newspapers, it is very true that many local newspapers change their positions because of the huge profit from advertisement of power plants.
Very good. I think we should probably, 6 o'clock is our end point. So let me just sum up very quickly 3 main points. And then with your permission, Michael, I'll tell a very quick story that I think will have value. But to sum up, I think we agree that Japan has an important role in the 21st century, but it has yet to discover what it is. The second thing is that the one single deficiency that everyone on the panel and I think in the room agrees on is the ineptitude of the political establishment, which leads to the third point, which is the TPP may, or may not, be the key to Japan repositioning itself in Asia, but it will take political guts and cause political trauma to do it. And in that connection, I wanted to end with a story, if I might. I think it'll take me about 2 minutes, with your forbearance. It's the kind of story, actually, you can take 20 minutes to tell, but I will give the 2-minute version. And it has to do, and some of you have probably heard it, and if you have, just be quiet. And those of you who haven't heard it, believe me, I think you'll agree it's a gem. And basically what happens is you have this cruise ship, okay, and it's gonna sink. And the problem with this cruise ship is, have you heard this story? That the problem with this cruise ship is that they have a lot more passengers than they have lifeboats. And additionally, they only have enough lifeboats for women and children. And so the American captain has figured this out, that if the women and children are going to have to go first, but he's dealing with a very multinational, multicultural group of passengers, and each nationality has to be convinced in a special way to allow the women and children to go first in the lifeboats. So he figures probably the American passengers are going to be the easiest, okay? Because he brings the Americans in and he says, look, American guys, just the men, we have a problem and we got to get the women and children. Let me ask you this, are Americans, do you consider yourself heroes? Americans, heroes. I mean, John Wayne and, we save the world and, world safe for democracy. Of course, then the women and children are going to have to go first. Well, of course, the women, we're heroes. Then Americans leave. He says, well, that was the easy one. He brings the British in, and he says, how am I going to say, the British, yeah. Is the British man, is he a gentleman? Well, of course we're Terry, could you think otherwise? Of course. Well, a gentleman will let the women and children go, yes, absolutely. That was easy. Jimmy go out. Then you bring in the Italians. And he's a very smart captain, as you can see. And the Italians, they come in, and he says, Italians, you are Italian men. Do you love women? Oh, we love the women. We all love the women, Then the women and children have to go first. He's worried a little bit about the Germans. Brings all the German men in, and he says, oh, I know what to do. Did you know it's the rule that women and children must go first? Oh, the rule. So that's no problem. So then he has the French. French, how am I going to convince the Frenchman? Brings the Frenchman in and he says, you won't believe this, but we're having a problem and we got to get the women and the children off first. And the Americans are against it? Well, then we think the women and children should go first. You see? So finally, he brings in the Japanese passengers. And the Japanese men come in and he goes, we have a problem, and the problem is we need to get women and children on the boats first, and the Americans agree, and the Germans agree, and the British agree, and even the French agree. And the Japanese look at one and they go, also a consensus. There's a consensus, and the Japanese agree the women and children should go first. Until there's a consensus in Japan, not much happens. But when you get a consensus, a lot can happen. Let's wish Japan has a very good consensus. Thank you very much. Great panel, huh?